some opening remarks, really more for just the clarification of my position and the way I do things, because we don't know each other yet. I do my very best when I present information to do it from the classical point of view, as it has been taught to me. So this information in this lecture is presented from the viewpoint of Hermetic philosophy. There are all kinds of viewpoints about all kinds of words and conceptions that we have about what alchemy is and what alchemy is to certain people. And I'm not here to say one is alchemy and one is not. I am here to say that from the classical Hermetic philosophy point of view, this is the definition of alchemy that we are working with in the context of this presentation, so that we can agree on basic terms, so that we can actually clearly communicate. Because if we don't agree on the meanings of the terms, we're not really having meaningful discourse. So I try to be really careful about that. I'm not out to convince anyone of anything. My only objective is to present clear information from a classical alchemical point of view and the high magical arts from the same point of view, because they are very connected. I will always make clear distinctions between what adepts have said to me, what I've been taught, what I've experienced, and what may just be opinion or speculation based on an educated hypothesis that I have not yet tested to find out, but have fairly reasonable assurance that it's most likely correct. By the time I say something like that, I'm pretty sure that it's correct, and usually will have gotten confirmation from someone that it doesn't mean that I've tested it myself yet. So I try to be really clear about those things, because I think that's really important. And then for purposes of clear communication, I will try to define the terms as I'm using them, as they're used in initiatory alchemy teaching. And then that enables the meaning that I give and the understanding without making anyone else's definitions an issue. Later on, if somebody wants to align with the definition that I give because it allows them to create a template that makes more sense to them, that's their personal choice. But I'm not here to debate or argue or make anybody right or anybody wrong or any of that stuff. The reason I go through all these little opening remarks is because I tend to be very passionate about certain things, and it can come across as a little imperious, and I don't mean it to be. But I know that can happen because I know myself. So it comes across when I write and things like that, and I even have a friend that helps me edit those things out because she knows I don't mean it either. It just comes out that way. So there's a lot of high-level concepts, and the word alchemy is used ubiquitously throughout all kinds of spiritual and metaphysical literature. But a classical Hermetic adept would say that the vast majority of the connotations that are used are not necessarily alchemy proper. It doesn't mean that transformation doesn't occur. What it means is that while alchemy is transformation, transformation is not necessarily alchemy. So transformation is great, but when we're working with the definitions of things in order to build a context for understanding something much deeper later, it's really important to clarify that. So somebody having a transformational experience, it doesn't invalidate it by saying that's not alchemy. It's just getting the right label on there so we can communicate. So there's lots of conceptions about alchemy, and it's good to talk about those kind of from the beginning. One of the things that happens between the magical community and the alchemical community is that for a long time there's been this rift down the middle. In the classical laboratory alchemy tradition, they're a little more left-brained. And then in the classical magical traditions, a lot of times they're very right-brained. And they have these funny notions. And the notions that come about over a period of time. And we'll get into some of those things. But basically, lab alchemists have a tendency of believing that alchemy was just laboratory stuff only, and all of the magical stuff is just a bunch of fuzzy woo-woo and it's not actually real. And that's because they've generally had very little magical training, because they're drawn to the lab work. On the other side, in a much larger percentage of the population, is the magical mindset. And they have been led through various authors in the past, of the last 100 years, to come to the conclusion that physical laboratory alchemy isn't necessarily real, that it's mostly a mental, internal kind of thing. Both sides are basically missing the balance of the other. Each has important pieces, but it's a lock and key system, like a tumble lock. A tumble lock connected to three-dimensional chess connected to another tumble lock. It's very interconnected. My view and the integrated view of these things is a more holistic view. So all of those things have their place. It's knowing where they fit in a template that makes a picture that then makes sense. Because alchemy is an art, but it is also a science. The Hermetic arts, Hermetic sciences are both art and science. And that means that they are empirical. They can be measured. They can be tested. And in fact, if you can't measure and test it, that basically means you don't understand. If you don't understand, you go back to the drawing board until you do. And that's the check and balance that a unified approach to Hermetic studies, that's its purpose. On one hand, alchemy is where we prove that we understand. Because if you don't understand how to take something, separate it, purify it, put it back together again, you're not going to be able to do it. There's no self-deception. There's no fooling yourself into thinking grandiose things that are not actually true. Whereas on the magical side, because that check and balance isn't there as much, it is, but it's a lot more intangible in terms of there's no exact specific physical thing. You can only produce that physical phenomena in the magical tradition much further down the path of mastery than you can in the beginning of alchemy, where in the beginning you can actually create something that is a spiritual substance. So because that happens way further down the road, and a lot of magical traditions are also approached from a somewhat religious point of view, it's very inappropriate to question things. And in fact, if you question too many things, you become the rogue that gets left out because you question things too much. You get the same basic response from them that you get from the priests when you're little, when you ask questions that they can't answer and they tell you don't worry about it. I asked a lot of those questions. I was raised Catholic. The reason why understanding both magic and alchemy in context of each other, and even though the purpose of this lecture is really the alchemy, and that I can fit into the number of hours we have and do it for reasonable justice. One for magic would probably be like a 4-day camp. There's just so much more to present the underlying theory for that to actually make sense. But the reason why it's important to talk about magic, even though we're focusing on alchemy, is because the power is in the overlap. It's in the understanding the in-between part where true initiatory progress is made, because they are both part of each other. Just studying one in isolation helps you get a little bit more one down, but without the integration, there's a glass ceiling, and it's not very far up. Unless you begin to take and integrate both, you never get past that. You can have all kinds of experiences, but they're very horizontal. There's no real vertical expansion. The definition of alchemy that we're working on is from a classical point of view. The classical point of view has to do with the separation of the 4 elements, or the 3 principles, depending on how you're looking at the process that you're doing. Purifying them and then recombining them to create one thing. That one thing is not a state of being that you find in nature. It's created by art. Now, I'm not saying that there is a 0% chance that somewhere out in the world that there is a little pocket of quintessence being formed, because I can't say that, because the universe is a mysterious place. Everything is happening all around us is alchemy. Every aspect of it is a spagyric mechanic. It's separating and it's combining. It's doing what it's supposed to do. But it's such an open system that the subtler, finer parts get dissipated so quickly. We can't see it. We can't catch them. We can't do it. So alchemy happens in a closed system. We can see and capture all of those subtle pieces and parts and see what's really happening. The idea of the one thing is really, really important. It is, in fact, probably the most important thing to get from having a correct hermetic mindset. And that comes from what we call the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. So I'm just going to read it. In truth, without deceit, certain and most veritable, that which is below corresponds to that which is above, and that which is above corresponds to that which is below, to accomplish the miracles of the one thing. And just as all things have come from this one thing, through the meditation of one mind, so do all created things originate from this one thing through transformation. Its father is the sun, its mother the moon. The wind carries it in its belly. Its nurse is the earth. It is the origin of all, the consecration of the universe. Its inherent strength is perfected if it is turned into earth. Separate the earth from fire, the subtle from the gross, gently and with great ingenuity. It rises from earth to heaven and descends again to earth, thereby combining within itself the powers of both the above and the below. Thus will you obtain the glory of the whole universe. All obscurity will be clear to you. This is the greatest force of all powers because it overcomes every subtle thing and penetrates every solid thing. In this way was the universe created. From this comes many wondrous applications, because this is the pattern. Therefore am I called thrice greatest Hermes, having all three parts of the wisdom of the whole universe. Herein I have completely explained the operation of the sun. This one little page has in it so much. This is just distilled by a brilliant mind and put down. There is nothing superfluous in this, and there's nothing left out. Our job is to come to understand it so that we can apply it. Most of the time, though, without true initiatory alchemical teaching, meaning being taught by an adept or being taught by someone who was taught by an adept, what these things really mean is left to a very subjective definition when there is actually a very specific definition. But we've all heard the as above, so below. The part that's left out is usually the to accomplish the miracles of the one thing, which is the rest of that sentence. It all comes from here. But the way things are normally presented, they're selectively presented. The as above, so below was made very popular by the Kybalion, written by the three initiates, which may or may not have been William Walker Atkinson. We don't know for sure, but we know for sure that he was the one who used pseudonyms to publish a lot of the other stuff that was published by that Yogi Society. The other thing in the next rubric when it's talking about the elements is that its inherent strength is perfected if it is turned into earth. Then the very next thing is to separate the earth from fire. If you don't know how to get the earth out of fire, you can't do what it's talking about. Well, that's a really specific thing. I mean, it's a little tricky, but it's really, really tricky if you don't even know what it means. So you've got to have someone explain to you what these stages and these rubrics actually mean. Part of what I hope to convey is clarity about that. So we go back to this a lot because it's a constant reminder about the one thing. And the as above, so below comes into play because what's true in the macrocosm is true on a microcosm is true in the microcosm of the thing that we're creating. And the highest truth on that one level has to also be replicated on the lower level, or we're not doing it right. The reason I emphasize that is because alchemy is about making quintessences. Physical laboratory alchemy is about making quintessences. There's other levels to alchemy, inner work that is truly alchemical, that leads to profound psychospiritual change. But from the viewpoint of making quintessences, most of the books that are out there on this subject, they're not really teaching people how to make quintessences. It's a really advanced form of herbalism most of the time. But even if someone had done all of the preparatory work to create a spagyric plant quintessence, which is a little bit redundant, but those are made by having what we call the philosophical sulfur, the philosophical mercury, and the philosophical salt, the three principles. And they're obtained, purified, and then put back together again. Putting them back together again isn't just putting them all in a bottle and shaking it up. But that's what people are making and selling on the market, and they're calling them spagyrics. We're going to get into the distinctions about all of those things so that someone looking at it can really tell whether what somebody is saying is real is actually real or not. But what I'm trying to do is give the tool sets for you to have the framework to decide for yourself, is what's being presented real or not, based on the rules. So let's talk about approaching the study of practical alchemy. Plant alchemy is traditionally what we call the prima work. It's the first work for a number of reasons. It's far less dangerous than the mineral work. And it's where we learn all of the processes, or all of the, maybe more the overarching level of the processes in the mineral work. The processes are the same, but there are some other things you have to overcome. In the plant work, there is a lot less to overcome because plant salts are far more agreeable to certain things than the salts from metals and minerals and things. So the prima work is where we start. The funny thing is that there's very little actually published on the prima work. Over the last 1,000 years, I'd say up until maybe 200 years ago, the most published thing in the world, perhaps aside from the Bible, were books on alchemy. It was a huge cottage industry because pound for pound, you could get more for a book on alchemy than you could just a book on whatever. It created a huge influx of quote unquote alchemical information being pushed out into the European world. And most of it was written by charlatans who were really good at copying ideas and plagiarizing and presenting things and making it look like it was alchemical. So you could get 50 times more for the book. So if you're a scrivener and you have a certain amount of paper and a certain amount of leather and you can make a book and you get 50 times more for it than you can a book about whatever else, I can understand why a lot of them were industrious enough to go about doing it. Some of them were probably not trying to be disingenuous, but many of them were. It led to a whole era of discovery that kind of is what we've inherited in the modern world, because it led to a lot of physical manipulation without understanding the theory behind what they were looking for and why they were doing it. And it left out the mind component of reality. So if you look at our modern sciences, which everyone hails that we've inherited from the Greeks and the Greek thinking, a lot of the Greeks in that thought process were kind of leaving out mind. It became very materialistic. And that's part of the schism between alchemy and sciences. And that's why we have what we have. The older texts are sketchy at best if we don't really have training and really know what is right and what's not. So it's almost better to avoid them altogether until you've been taught some stuff. The problem with that is that the modern texts on the subject, with few exceptions, are pretty much just rehashed versions of what Frater Albertus taught. Now, Frater Albertus was a very cool guy. He was an alchemy teacher that taught within the Rosicrucian order. And he was the one person responsible for most of the alchemical and teaching and instruction and the energy put into having it to teach in the first place. And at a certain juncture, Louis Spence, who was the head of the Rosicrucian order, decided that the Rosicrucian order was no longer going to teach alchemy, which is bizarre because the Rosicrucian order is supposed to be alchemically based. But they decided they weren't going to teach alchemy. So Frater Albertus said, fine, if the Rosicrucians aren't going to teach it, I'll go teach it myself. And that's what he did. But that created a whole set of interesting challenges for him. He understood a lot more about the mineral work because there was a lot more written about it. And in the course of the studies and figuring things out, he'd made a lot of progress in that. But because prima work is generally starting with the plant work, what he attempted to do was take that classical mineral work training and apply it to the plant kingdom and create a process for what looked like classical elements and how they would be used in plant work. And for the last 45-ish years, that thought process has colored what everyone pretty much thinks is alchemy done with plants. And it's led to a whole string of cascading repercussions of opinions about what alchemy is and whether plant alchemy is actually alchemy because of the results of what those things do or don't do. Because they don't line up with classical results for good reasons, which I'm going to elaborate on. I will say, and I'll say it again, that's not to diminish Frater Albertus in any way, because without him, most of us wouldn't be studying this concept openly. Before he attempted to create alchemical teaching from a classical point of view of four elements, this was really, truly, strictly the domain of adepts who kept it to themselves and only let in very few people who they felt were ready and appropriate and worth their time. Adepts are a grumpy bunch, let me tell you. And they don't take nonsense, and they don't have to. And they're very isolated. And as we know, isolation tends to make people a little less sociable. And the adepts are no exception to that. They like each other's company, and that's about it, because other people just don't have anything to say that they feel is worth listening to. And from a certain point of view, I can understand that. But that doesn't help us. Frater Albertus, what he did, as I presented certain parts of it, broken as it is, was still an incredible launching point to help us move forward. Sometimes you figure out what something is by first figuring out what it's not. And part of what he did was help us figure that out. And he wasn't a master by the time he died. Most people are not aware of the fact that he actually could create the Philosopher's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone. Not only could he create it, he could do it in a weekend, from scratch, start to finish, and do a transmutation. He only did that in front of a few people. Most of the people that are carrying on the legacy of Frater Albertus, I don't know if they know that. And from the way that they teach and the things that they do, I kind of have the working assumption that they don't, which means that he chose to segment who he showed and who he didn't. And so the people that we think that would have been closest to him, that were around him the most, may not have gotten to see that because he did it in New Zealand. He didn't do it here. It does make me scratch my head sometimes and wonder why he made those choices. But clearly, as a master, he had a reason. And it's not to question it, but it is to note that he did succeed in doing it. However, at the beginning of his alchemical trek, he was not a master. And the plant curriculum that he created was his best attempt at attempting to create it. If he got to do it over again by the time he was done, I'm sure he would have done it very differently. Taking all of that, trying to understand alchemy's place within Hermetic sciences itself, it's important to understand the placement of where things are. And it's not about something being better than something else. It's just how it is. The two main branches of Hermetic philosophy are alchemy and magic. There's a lot of other things that are labeled Hermetic because they kind of flow from those ideas. And because people haven't had access to really true initiatory teaching in alchemy and magic a lot of the times, other Hermetic sciences that are the lesser sciences have come about and become very popular. Divination, tarot, astrology, all of those things all still stem from the same source. They're just a step or two removed from the root. And at one point, they were all very interconnected. The way that they were taught in the ancient temples and the ancient initiatory systems, they were all aspects of one another that were used and taught to reflect each other in a holistic way, a holism, truly a complete thing. But I feel, and it has been said by adepts, that that was true in Egypt at a certain point of time. Later on, as Egyptian priests became corrupt and Egypt was conquered by Greeks, and Egyptians never trusted Greeks, so they didn't teach them the deeper things. Then the Greeks became pharaohs, and it all kind of went downhill after that. The initiatory stream left Egypt and went elsewhere through various mechanisms, and that's why we still have it. That's why it's still around. It's just not most of the time what is presented to look like. Alchemy is the mother science because it reveals the mechanics of what makes magic function. Regardless of your tradition, it doesn't matter whether you're Roman Catholic or Wiccan or Hermetic, Kabbalistic, Rosicrucian, Martinist. The mechanics of reality are defined by this aspect described in the Emerald Tablet. It's just the way it works. The mechanics of how it works on each different level is part of what the alchemist has to try to come to understand. The thing about approaching everything from this paradigm as a check system is that if it's true on one level, it's true on all levels. If it isn't true on all levels, it isn't true. Now, how it's true on each level doesn't necessarily look the same. What you learn to do in the lab work is a physical, mechanical thing that has a lot more aspects to it than just the physical manipulation, but it teaches us the mechanics. And the entire purpose of that, aside from obtaining quintessence on whatever level we're able to obtain it on, is to then understand the mechanism itself so that we can then begin to apply it to our mind. Because that's not physical in the sense where we can manipulate it, but there is a mechanism that you have to understand in order to be able to enter that overlap space that I was talking about being so important. It's understanding of the mechanics and not just the manipulation, but the underlying deeper capital U understanding of why you're doing what you're doing. If you understand the theory and the why, eventually you can find your way through it. If you just have a recipe and you don't have any understanding, you're probably never going to do it because there's always stuff left out of the recipe. It's just not in there. Just like a lot of the magical tradition is based on grimoires that were circulated around, and a lot of them were subject to the same plagiarized bastardization as alchemical texts. But even then, if you understand the concept of a grimoire, those were an individual person's working notes kept all in one place, but they never wrote it all down. It was kind of like an outline for the lecture. People that didn't have any of the training, that didn't have any of those spaces filled in, are just running around doing the steps in the grimoire thinking that they understand something. They don't understand anything. They're just trying to replicate what they think is in there. Now, some of them, if they're studying lots of other things and they've connected a few more dots, will figure a few things out, and then they may have some better luck. And if they actually succeed, then they may be able to receive direct instruction from an intelligence that may or may not be trusted. But at least it's progress. The chances increase as that happens. The thing that I really like about understanding alchemy's place within the Hermetic sciences is that if we come to understand it on a deeper level, we can see the validation in other things. So we can see where our commonalities are. So amongst all the different magical traditions, they all have their different ideas. The one thing that's universal to all of them is alchemy. They'll all agree to that. It's just that there's very few of them that actually have had initiatory training in alchemy to be able to make meaning from that commonality. And that's part of what I seem to be driven in the direction of doing, is helping people understand the alchemy part so that they can actually make more meaning within their own tradition without ever having to step outside of it. It doesn't matter if you're Roman Catholic or Wiccan or a Jewish mystic. It doesn't matter because the mechanics are the same for everyone. And all of those traditions have their own deeper initiatory paths. They're all there. This is why the magic lecture takes 4 days, because of showing where they are in each system to allow people to see that just because somebody is led to be more devotional and therefore being Roman Catholic is a more fulfilling religious path for them, and somebody else over here feels more witchy and being able to relate to the universe through a slightly different lens, doesn't mean at the end of the day that either one of them are doing anything any different. It's just that the way the path winds is more conducive to what that person needs in this particular incarnation. That's all it means. And so being able to see the processes of alchemy, if each of those traditions can do that, they can actually restore the purity of their paths without ever having to step outside them. And if they choose to, because they're led to. That's a whole other thing. But alchemy, it's a path in and of itself. It doesn't have to be exclusive of, if you want to do this and then you want to do alchemy, you have to pick. It's not exclusionary. It's just not necessary. The thing that's really cool about it is that you really do learn how to see the different aspects. In plant alchemy, you learn how to separate the spirit and the soul and the body of the plant, purify them, put them back together again to create this new one thing that we call a quintessence that doesn't exist in nature, but it has to be brought about by art. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the same thing has to be done on the other levels of being, the mental level. Then that makes us look at the mechanics of our religions, of what we choose as our religious path. If you just want to be devotional and not do God working, then it doesn't matter. But if what a person really craves is a religious path that is actually bringing them conscious evolution that they can experience and accelerate in one lifetime, then it really does matter. And that's what a lot of these magical traditions purport to offer, but have kind of lost. Or they're revivalist traditions that didn't lose it. They're trying to find it. And there's nothing wrong with either one of those. Kudos to all of them, because they've all contributed to the overall conversation that creates enough dots to piece things together. Sometimes I want to scream because there are things that the Theosophical Society put out into the world that have become embedded in the mindset of a lot of the magical community that are things that Madame Blavatsky just kind of made up and wrote down because that was her hypothesis at the time. If she had gotten to live for another 100 years, she'd have a very different hypothesis by now. But people have been dragging that around for a century. And she did some really awesome research that even allowed me to connect dots in places I would never have been able to do if it hadn't been for the research that she did. So we all stand on the shoulders of these people that were human, that were doing the best they could, that contributed to the conversation. So it's unfair to hold them in the same light, because if those people were still around in the same body, they would know a whole lot more by now, given an extra century to go dig around and find it. But what we have are frozen encapsulations. And so all we can do is extract from that. I take from it what works for me, and the rest of it is just there. You know, I don't have to judge it and make it right or wrong. I just don't have to pick it up and carry it around with me. So that's one of the pinnacles of growing in alchemical understanding, is being able to take what we see in the constructs that have been created for spiritual growth and break them down and look at them and say, this really lines up with classical alchemical point of view, or this lines up here, but then when we get to this part, they fall off track. And that explains why there are so many kinds of everything out there, why there are 1,600 kinds of Christianity. I think that was the number at the last count. It's because they all adopt slightly different viewpoints, and then they all say, well, this is really important to me, and they don't agree with that over there, but we think this is true. Instead of creating unity, we've created a mess. Eventually, the alchemical process results in a breakdown, a complete and total breakdown of the whole thing, and then something new is created out of it, which is why we see major religions going through about a 2,000-year cycle. Some of them 4,000 years, whatever. But within what we have as our recorded history, there are 4,000 and 2,000-year chunks. Some of them overlap, of course. But the lifespan of those religious things, they start off in a creative way. And then over time, there are enough aberrations and elaborations that eventually it just dissolves. And by necessity, something new comes out of all of that fertilized, dissolved stuff. Christianity, whether most people want to agree with it or not, was, by the time the Church of Rome got hold of it at least, a recreation of the entire Egyptian religion. It was a theocratic recreation. The reason they got away with nobody figuring that out for, well, see, from 300-ish on to 100 years ago was because nobody could translate hieroglyphics. They basically part and parcel hoodwinked the entire Egyptian religion and repackaged it. Now, that doesn't invalidate it, because the concepts that were embedded within Egyptian religion were perennial. The same thing within Catholicism. The Catholic means universal. That was their attempt. They were doing it with a slightly different allegory. And the allegory was pinned to a specific person who had an existence, which is one of the clever things about allegory we're going to talk about later. But if you look at every single aspect of their religions, down to even the corruptions that happened 1,000 years later after they were created, we think that a lot of the things that the priests in the Church of Rome did that were corrupt were very innovative and new. They weren't new at all. They stole those too. The selling of the absolutions, that was stuff the Egyptians did 2,000 years before the Church of Rome ever even came about. You can even see it in the changes that occur within the drawings on the walls of the processes that they're describing. The scales of Mat, that when a person dies, they would weigh your heart against the feather. Well, for a long time, it was just the scales and the feather. That's it. And if your heart was not lighter than the feather, then Sobek was there to eat you. And if you were, then you got to go on, and it shows the rest of the process. At a certain point in time, there develops this change in the way it was being presented, where Horus is standing there holding up your end with the heart to make it lighter than the feather. Horus, being the son of Isis and Osiris, the Christ figure in that trinity, is basically lifting the burdens of what people did in order to pass them through to the afterlife. So that story is not new. And we know it's not new because there were lots and lots and lots of savior gods before this was all pinned on Jesus. But in the Egyptian, we can just see it plain as day, the transition and what they did. And in order to make that happen, that's when the selling of absolutions within the Egyptian religion came about. And basically, the priests of Amun became corrupt, which after a while happens. And so the same things were happening in the Church of Rome. Martin Luther tried to fix it. His intention was never to not be Catholic. It was never to create a schism. It was never to do any of that. It was just to fix the problems. If he'd have been Pope, that would have been great. We might not have ever had a schism. We might still have a universal church that actually isn't screwed up. There is a plan, so it's under control. I don't make it right or wrong, because everything has to go through its evolution, has to eat its shadow, it has to do all of these things. Maybe the church has to do that too. But these are the things you begin to be able to see when you start to connect the dots in these processes that makes the learning of it exciting, but also illuminating. Because one of the things in the magical community that I've always felt was slightly dysfunctional, and I went through it myself, is that a lot of people turn to, well, except for those people raised in that mindset now, but a lot of us turned to those paths specifically because we see the holes in all the religious stuff that we were being taught, and that certain things were labeled bad and forbidden. And of course, those were the first places I wanted to go, but not because I wanted to be rebellious. It was because I wanted answers. At a certain point, I'm like, okay, well, if I have to talk to the devil to get answers, I don't care. I mean, I never tried to talk to the devil, but I mean, that was I would have thrown down right there, and I'm still that way. Now I would be like, oh, it's nice to meet you. there wouldn't be any fear about it. I understand that role now, and its vast importance, because there is a mechanistic need, or we wouldn't be able to exist and be here at all. The schism between alchemy and magic is a bit of a long section. I'd like to take just a little bit of a break.